Yesterday, we heard a lot of things about foreign and security policy. Today, day two kicks off with a very special discussion on race, equality, and cultural identity, values that are very important to the transatlantic relationship. And I'm delighted that both our panelists here are connected to GMF, very closely connected to GMF, and they're going to discuss how our liberal democracies across the Atlantic space are being challenged. Right here is Mitch Landrieu. He's a newly minted board member at GMF. He's also a book author, and many of you know him as the former mayor of New Orleans. He also was a lieutenant governor of the great state of Louisiana, and he's still continuing his public service. He recently established a nonprofit called E Pluribus Unum, which looks at questions of race and equity and economic growth in the American South. And then we have Sameera Rafaela. She was a participant in GMF's Transatlantic Inclusion Leadership Network in 2016. And we all have to offer her a congratulations because she's won her election and she's an incoming EU parliamentarian. So congratulations, Samira. So enjoy the discussion, and I am now going to pass over to our able moderator, Karel from Der Standard.
Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you had a good night's sleep. Let's dive into the conversation. In the midst of times in which elections are won on the basis of cultural identity, or rather on the basis of fear for those who seem to be threatening cultural identity, in times when all demons are coming back center stage, we have two guests here confronting the politics of identity with the politics of inclusion. And they have they have both their stories to tell. Let's go into your story, Mitch, because I was wondering while reading your book, what happened to you in these years when you became mayor? You were in the midst of a huge task of reconstructing, and suddenly your most arduous task became the confrontation of the past. What happened to you? What happened to society that the past turned up with such fierce force?
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for that question. You're going to find this peculiar, but when you were asking me that, I saw my mother's face going, what happened to you, son? As you know, I served as lieutenant governor in Louisiana after Katrina hit. All of you remember the pictures of the city of New Orleans. You gasped at the possibility of losing a great American city, and the pictures, which I think shocked a lot of people in the world, that there were that many poor people who had been dislocated and dispossessed by something that was a weather event, but also an infrastructure failure. The city languished for years. I then became the mayor. We had to rebuild the entire city. And as we were rebuilding the city, because it was structurally gone, we had to think about how to build the city back. Natural inclination is to always, after natural disasters or man-made disasters, a war, to put it back just like it was. And that's essentially a mistake almost all the time. And we had to ask ourselves, what were we building back? And we decided, as members of our city, not to build the city back the way it was. Because as much as we love the city of New Orleans, as much as it's one of the world's great, beautiful architectural gems, music gems, food gems, and also cultural gems that represent the diversity of the world, that we had to look at ourselves and realize that we had gotten a lot of things wrong. So we didn't want to put the city back the way it was. We wanted to put it back the way it should have been had we gotten it right the first time. And so while we were going through the exercise of reconstructing physical buildings, designing them in the right way, we also had to deal with some of our really difficult issues. And one of the deep divides in America has been our nation's original sin, which is race. So the city of New Orleans, notwithstanding the fact that she is a miraculously wonderful city, is also the place where we sold the most human beings into slavery in the United States of America. And standing in the middle of our most prominent circle, it would be kind of like outside of this hotel, was a statue to a Confederate general whose mission it was to divide the United States of America and destroy it, as it was known at the time, for the cause of preserving the institution of slavery, which just seemed to be so idiosyncratic and so not in keeping with what New Orleans actually was. And because our ethos, not only in New Orleans, because we thought we were a good representation of it in modern America, that everybody comes to the table of democracy as equals and the diversity is a strength. It occurred to us that those monuments were actually historical lies and didn't reflect who we ever had been. And so we had to make a really tough decision to say this is who we're going to be going forward, because we do think inclusion is important. And there was no way for young African-American men or women or other folks to look at that monument in any other way, because that monument was on public property and it was representing a view of the government, and say that that monument was representative of who we were supposed to be as Americans. And so we decided to take them down.
But as a young man, you passed these monuments for thousands of times without looking at them, without thinking about them. What made you aware so much?
It's a great question. A very good friend of mine smacked me on the back of the head. That's essentially what happened. You all will know him. You'll think I'm name dropping, but he actually is a childhood friend. His name is Wynton Marsalis, who's one of the greatest musicians that the world has known. But essentially, he's also a great historian, and music is his medium. And if you ever listen to him talk, he'll give you a great exposition on how jazz music actually formed and represents democracy about as well as anything in the world. Out of many, one. Different forms of music from different cultures coming together to create something new and better than was ever there before, essentially is what his theory of jazz music was. And we were talking one day because I had asked him to help me curate the 300th anniversary of New Orleans, which was going to take place in 2018. So in 2014, I was having this conversation with him, and he checked me as the mayor of the city. He said, he said, I'll help you do that, but I want you to do something for me. And I said, what do you want? He says, I want you to take the monument of Robert E. Lee down. Now, anybody who's a politician that's got a half a wit knows that he just said, I want you to go to war. And I went, oh, hell no. You know what? Why do you want me to do that? And he said to me, like a good friend does, who pierced my consciousness, he said, well, have you ever thought about that monument from my Wynton's perspective, a young African-American kid? And then he said to me, Louis Armstrong left this city because of that. Now, when he told me that, what also happened was that my consciousness, which was aware of something, really kind of came flushing forward, which is I was fully aware of the great diaspora that occurred in the South after slavery ended, when African Americans in the South and other people of good conscience fled because it was inhospitable to people of different races, creeds, colors, national origin, sexual orientation. So the talent, raw material, raw talent, intellectual capital fled the South. And we have suffered for it tremendously ever since, because the notion back then was not that diversity was a strength, that it was a weakness, and that only certain people could do certain things and other people were superior to others. And that notion throughout our life, throughout history, wherever it occurs on our earth, is a bad notion that needs to get put down. And the reason it's so compelling today is because that notion is beginning to resurrect itself again and cannot be resurrected anywhere in the world without challenge. So you heard General Allen talk about this yesterday in the context of white nationalism, white supremacy, and climate change. When climate change is going to force 100 million on the high side and 50 million on the low side to start moving from where they are to other places, or immigration is threatening and all the things, and then people are afraid of each other because of how they look, what their politics is, who they love, you're going to have an intense social deterioration that is anathema to us being a peaceful society. And so I crunched a lot into that, but make a long story short, it became apparent to me really early that this was one of the steps that the country had to take in the South, in the United States, to do our part to make sure that we lived up to what America's ideals were. Because we talk a good game, we don't always walk the walk, but we always hold ourselves accountable, and this was a step towards doing that.
Now, looking at the statistics of New Orleans, a mayor has quite a task there. Half of the black man is unemployed. 1 in 2 black children lives in poverty. You would think that tackling a symbol is one of the lesser worries.
Yeah, didn't you? You're right. Yeah, you know, it was really interesting because essentially it's just a piece of stone and metal. And you would think that taking one down would be easy, but it wasn't. We scratched really, really deeply, and people were very threatened by this notion that somehow we were taking something away that was so incredibly important. the message that I gave to the people is we're not taking anything away. We're actually opening up, adding value, and giving people a great opportunity to have a better history going forward. And so when you ask me, you know, how did you walk by that monument every day and not understand it? We actually do this every day in our lives because we're so worried about feeding our kids, going to work. We walk by symbols of institutional racism and actual institutions of racism throughout our entire life, and we don't change them. And even people of goodwill who are not necessarily aggressive or overt racist are not really tuned into the kinds of things that in the United States, African Americans are burdened with that other individuals are not. And I think our country has to think about those, and we have to redesign them because they were designed this way. And it's a mission, I'll just speak for my country, that we in America have to work through. I think it is clearly true in other countries as well, because hatred, or the seed of hatred, you know, is nurtured everywhere. And those are the things that lead to war. Those are the things that lead to famine. Those are the things that lead to some people having and other people's not having. And in liberal democracies, the essential element is that we all come to the table as equals. And every human being has great dignity and great worth and great value and should add to rather than take away from. And that's essentially why I think many people responded to it, because it was a universal conflict that has not yet been resolved.
Were you shocked by the kind of emotions that erupted once you started taking these monuments down?
I wasn't shocked by it because I basically lived it my entire life.
So you were aware of how culturally embedded racism is?
Oh, yeah. No, I wasn't shocked by it. I was a little surprised by how hard it was because I thought we were more ready, but I wasn't surprised by it. I expected fully for people to be very angry and very frustrated because our nation hasn't yet, the United States of America has not gone through race the way, for example, Germany has tried to repair the damage that it did as a result of the Holocaust, or South Africa has functionally walked through it. We in the United States kind of just go around it, go over it, go under it. We talk about it from time to time, but we never really, in a disciplined way, say we're going to get to the other side. And my strong feeling and recommendation for my fellow countrymen is to let's have that talk now, because it's better on the other side, actually. It's not good in the space that we're in. And it certainly was terrible in the space that came before. And so I think it's part of us growing up. We're still a very young country, historically speaking.
And it goes, of course, really deep, because this is also about really strong emotions. It's about recognition. People wanted to be recognized for their history and also for their pain and for their struggles. So it goes really deep.
It's interesting that you mentioned Germany, because we can cross to Europe. In Europe, we tend to think that we've got racism more or less behind us, and only slightly last decade we start to realize that we have to confront it yet. One of the interesting things is that just the other day, this week, on the front pages of the newspapers in the Netherlands, there was this Dutch study on the economics of slavery. It used to be thought that slavery hardly contributed to the Dutch economy, and now there was a rework and rethink of the economy. And in 1770, in the high days of slavery, 5% of the GDP of the Dutch Republic was based on slavery, and even 10% of the GDP of the province of Holland, the richest province. These were staggering figures. How come that we have to wait till 2019 to make this economic analysis?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, that's what I also meant with it's about really strong emotions, and it's really, really time that people are being recognized for, again, for their history, for their personal history, for the impact of that history, for the impact of, so for what happened and the effect of that. And it's 2019, and to be honest, I think that's really late. It only makes it more difficult to discuss these emotions, to discuss these pains. And I'm glad that we started to talk about it, because it's really necessary, because we see the negative effects of that. We see that it also leads to polarization. We see that it leads to people not understanding each other. We see that it leads to segregation. We see that it leads to conflicts and people not talking to each other anymore. So it is really, really the time now to speak about it openly, that we give recognition to that, and that we understand why this part of history was so hurtful. Because we see generations now growing up in our society that got that part of history also in the way they grew up. They heard the stories, they still see the pain, they still feel the pain, even though they are part of the younger generation like I am. And it's really time to start talking about it and the impact of that.
We have the debate in Europe seems to be heating up on the statues of colonialism and slavery that are erected to the statues of Leopold here in Belgium. Why is it that each debate in each of these cases in different countries is so heated and so creates such a division of not understanding? Don't touch history. Don't rewrite history, people say that.
Well, again, because we started very late with the debate, with the dialogues about this. But there's also something really, I noticed something really uncomfortable with the confrontation itself. So I noticed that when we want to start discuss the position of others in terms of respect, in terms of security, or in terms of also social security, then there's something really uncomfortable the moment we do that, because instead of trying to understand and trying to listen to that, most of the time people respond really defensive. And that is exactly the kind of behavior that will not work out in a positive way. So it's really time that also, like for example in education, in schools, but also in the workplace, we start to work on methods that can make these kind of conversations more easily. But the confrontation is really needed, and there's something uncomfortable with the confrontation now. And again, that leads to polarization, that leads to conflict. So we need to put pressure on that. But there's also responsibility for politicians, for example, to facilitate that dialogue, to not back down or to not move away from that conversation.
Should you go into confrontation each time that you see this racism popping up?
Yes.
Is that the strategy? We'll turn to it in a minute, but...
Yeah, of course we need to confront that. And again, there's a role for politicians, for example. There's a role for people working in government, but also in civil society, to facilitate these discussions and these dialogues.
Can I turn to your personal experience? What creates more strain in Dutch society? The fact that you're a woman of color, or that you're a Muslim? What is makes people, create this unease in society that clearly is in society, if you look at the election results?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, because, some topics are painful to discuss, but I believe that we really need to discuss them. I mean, we need to do the confrontation in a really, it can be in an effective way, it can be in a respectful way, but you need people who are either setting it on the agenda, or who dare to discuss this. And in my personal opinion, I mean, the reason that I wanted to enter politics, I already said from a really young age, I want to enter politics. I grew up with a father who is from Ghanaian and Nigerian roots, a Muslim man, and a mother who is Jewish, Dutch, and Caribbean. So I grew up with a lot of cultures and religions, but it also showed me, I mean, I have a personal history, the Jewish side, but also the personal history of my African and Caribbean grandparents and great-grandparents. So I have a personal history that is about recognition, that is about justice, that is about asking for justice and recognition. And on a really young age, it made me aware that equal opportunities are not there for everyone. So that was for me the most important reason to enter politics. And I also saw that there's a lack of representation, good representation, that there's a lack of diversity, for example, in politics. And that is exactly needed to, for example, discuss these kind of subjects, to make sure that we have many people with many backgrounds, bringing in different perspectives, or that can explain why some things are hurtful or really needed to discuss. So again, for me, that's one of the most important reasons to enter politics, to also facilitate these kind of
And
dialogues.
how do you do that in concrete terms? Because
Yeah.
you say it's my reason to go into politics is
Yeah.
to confront radical
Yeah.
extremism.
Yeah.
But how do you do that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, entering politics, stepping forward, that's really important. And especially I experienced myself that being young, a woman of color, that it's really needed that you also need an environment that supports you in that. The necessity of role models is really, really necessary. And people who believe in you. So that's the first step. And then entering politics, I mean, it's really important that you know what your ambition is. So I know that I want to enter politics to fight extremism, indeed, to confront people with that, to make sure that also subjects are being put on the agenda that are also really important for the communities I come from, for example. Because I can understand that, because I grew up with that, I grew up with the knowledge. And I believe that the future of politics is really grassroots. We need to be involved with communities, we need to be involved with people. We need to have the dialogues, we need to listen more, because politicians, we are really good in talking, as you can notice, but it's also really important that we learn how to listen. And that we also learn, that we also make sure that we bring that back to the table, where, for example, legislation is being made, where, for example, policies is being made. But therefore, you need diversity. You need different people with different backgrounds coming from the communities, bringing that back to the table and do something with that.
Crucial issue for the left is, of course, how to win elections with that. Let's turn to a chapter on politics. May I turn to what you say on Trump and Trump in politics?
But may I make a comment about what she just
Of
said?
course.
So she just crystallized for you the reason why this is important. You're a Muslim. You have Jewish heritage. Years ago, if she was in the United States, would have been sold into slavery. Today, Donald Trump wouldn't let her in the country. Many, many years ago, if your heritage as being Jewish was real, you may have been executed. And she would have never been or disappeared. So when you say, well, why did you take the monuments down? Well, if my job as the leader of a city is to have a city and to care for everybody, or to raise up the future, or to do justice, well, I mean, here it is. She would have never, ever been elected to anything. And we would have, not only would that have been unjust and unfair for her, we would have lost her spectacular intellect and talent. And my question to the world is, how many people have we lost? How many wars have we fought? Because we have thought that some of us were better than others. That's just that simple. So as we're sitting in this event, I know we're talking about justice and we're talking about people having the right to be seen because it's fair for them to do so. But think about it from a national security perspective. And ask yourself whether or not these are the reasons why we have the kinds of conflicts that actually result in many, many, many human beings being killed over time. And what's happening today, which is so dangerous, which in my mind is a national security threat, both at home and abroad. Let me start at home. For some reason, President Trump never tweets out much when a white guy picks up a gun and kills a whole bunch of people. Doesn't say much about it. But if it is a person of color, or if they have Muslim heritage, they are tagged with being a terrorist. And we don't call it domestic terrorism. If you're the mayor of a major American city, and you get called and said 24 people just got shot in a playground, or in a theater, or et cetera, for some reason, people go to sleep on that as though that's not something that threatens domestic tranquility. It does. And when the impetus is race, like it was in Charlottesville, when there was terrorism and somebody ran over somebody else because they didn't like the way they looked or because they didn't like their political philosophy, that's a huge challenge. And then what then tends to happen, and you said this a minute ago, you said, well, in Europe, we thought we were past race. In the United States, we did as well. We thought we were past populism and nationalism that gave rise to autocratic rulers. But I know that you all feel across the world that's fermenting itself in nations all over the place. So this just isn't an American problem, because hatred and the seed of hatred has been with us forever. And when it begins to raise its head, yes, you must confront and say that seed is going to produce bad fruit. And if we continue to let it go unabated and we don't challenge it rhetorically, we don't challenge it from a policy perspective, we don't call it out for what it is, it's not just a matter of justice, although that's a critically important part. It's not just a matter of liberty. It's about social cohesion, and it's about our personal security. And when in history we have allowed it to flourish and we have not checked it, then we find ourselves in some major security conflicts that result in death. And that is not good. So not only is it as a matter of justice necessary, as a matter of security it is as well, and we ignore it to our peril. And there are lots of signs that not only is it not abating, that actually it's getting a little bit worse at the moment.
Yeah, and I totally agree, and I can tell from my own experience. I mean, I've worked at the Netherlands police in the commissioner's staff on inclusion, and I can tell that when you don't, that's why I find it very important that we work on social equality, and also in Europe, also within the European Parliament, we really need to work on a strong social Europe, because that's what I and my colleagues will do. We need to do that, and not only because that's really because we see that if you don't work on social equality in your society, but I've seen it also from a security perspective at the Netherlands police, that if you don't work at social equality, you will face security issues. I mean, that was also the reason why I did study on radicalization and terrorism, and I was really interested in what the causes were of
what
radicalization.
What did you see there?
Well, what you see is that
Were you studying Muslim radicalization or
No.
any kind of political radicalization?
No, I studied radicalization, and I studied two examples of groups in Europe, but also one in Africa, where you could really see a strong process of radicalization, and there were different causes, and especially social and economic causes. So the moment that you have social and economic inequality, that hurts the society in a way that people don't think they are being hurt by politics, that people don't feel part of society, that people will find other ways to participate, or negative ways. That is not really positive for the development of the society or for security in society. So it is really important that we work on the fundament, and that is social equality, so that we see that we need to do less with security issues, like, for example, radicalization. And that's why it is, again, so important to make sure that our institutions, that politics, but also police forces, are diverse, so that
How did you find
they
the
can
Dutch
represent
police?
the society.
How did you find the Dutch police? Was it in what state did you find? Because you're a counsel for a national level.
Well, I'm really glad with what the Dutch police is doing right now. I mean, they are investing a lot right now in trainings about inclusion. They are looking into specific tools and methods to make sure that, for example, more diverse people are being part of the commissions that select and recruit people. So they're doing a lot about it. But still, there needs to be more awareness. But that's not only for the Dutch police forces. So it's also really important that in Europe, police forces will work together and exchange knowledge and ideas about this. So I'm really glad with that. But still, there needs to be, of course, more awareness. There needs to be more diversity within the police force. But they're working on that, and that's really good, because it starts with awareness. That's really good, and it will take time, but they're on it, and that's the most important thing, to be aware of that.
And the diversity is not just about race; it's about gender as
No,
well.
it's
So, for example,
really
with police
broad,
departments, a long time ago, police departments were mostly white men in the United States of America. And as a consequence of not having a diverse police department, if there was domestic abuse, sexual abuse, sex crimes, the police officers were never properly trained to investigate any of that. Now that the police departments have become more diverse, more women have become police officers. One of the best police chiefs in America was the police chief in Washington, D.C. For many, many, many years. You're beginning to make sure that citizens can be taken care of when the police show up. This is not a novel idea, but it would be great that when, and by the way, most police officers are spectacular. They risk their lives. They do a good job. If they're trained properly, supervised properly, if there's transparency and accountability, when a police officer shows up, you feel comfortable, and they're there to protect you. But what if you were in a position when they showed up, your history taught you that they were there to hurt you? That's not a great recipe for peace and success. And police departments all over the world, but I'll speak to America, have in the last couple of years really started to get a lot better. In the city of New Orleans, when I became mayor, our police department was a mess. I invited the United States Department of Justice to come in so that we could actually retrain every police officer, put a body camera on every one of them, have open transparency and accountability when there was a police-involved shooting, really diversified the police force, men and women racially, so that when the police, they're doing it in a way to, this just sounds so sophomoric, but to protect and to serve, not to oppress and to hurt. It sounds so simple, but if you're not trained appropriately, and you're trained to shoot first, not last, and you're trained to look askew at the citizens that you're there to protect as opposed to someone you're there to protect, then it produces bad results. And when that happens, and it happens a lot in the community retrenches. They then begin to radicalize in domestic ways, and then it produces lack of social cohesion, which essentially, if you have no social cohesion when a bad thing happens, a climate event or some kind of violent event, that's when, number one, you're not capable of being able to receive the bad thing, and secondly, you can't respond to it. And so a lot of what was talked about yesterday on the national security front really came home to me as a domestic politician about being prepared for what is coming our way, from adapting to getting better at it, to being more resilient, to being able to respond. And we don't really prepare as well as we should. And our tendency is to wait, to deny, to put off for another day what we want to know today, to understand that we have major threats coming our way, but really not making the sacrifices necessary to be ready for when those bad things happen. And that's not good for us.
And also the lack of legitimacy and the lack of trust within these communities towards, for example, police forces is really dangerous. It's really a risk. And that's also, for example, a reason why, for example, the Dutch police force is now facing the challenge to engage people from that communities within the police forces. So it's more difficult to recruit or to select people from the communities because there's a lack of trust and legitimacy, and that's a circle that you need to break through, because it's also very dangerous, and it's also very important that people have the feeling that, okay, when the police comes, the police is also there for me. That feeling, but also the use of language also coming from the police force saying that, hey, we want to be a police for everyone, is extremely important.
Now, in order to put these policies in place, in order to raise the awareness, to start the inclusion, you have to grab power, you have to win elections. The confrontation is that many voters do not share these views. Now, the burning issue on the left is how to address these voters. If you talk about Trump, about the Make America Great Again, the again being the dog whistle. Now, would you say then that voters...
You know what a dog whistle is? That's good. I thought that was just us in the South. Everybody. So you want to know how to do it?
No, I would ask, then you would say that these voters are responding to his racial tendencies, his racial remarks. You have to listen to voters. In what way do you have to address these voters on their racism or on their exclusion? How to address these issues? What's your moral point of view?
Would you like me to? Well, first of all, not everybody that voted for Donald Trump was a racist. There are many, many people that voted for Donald Trump that voted for him but they voted for President Obama, and then they voted for President Trump. And the reasons they voted for him were legitimate reasons about why voters choose who they want to lead them in democracies. They felt left out. They felt not seen. The same conversation we're having right now about African Americans, coal miners in West Virginia could have, where they said, well, nobody saw us, nobody addressed us, nobody talked to us, nobody really thought about who we were. Same issue. And so I don't want to even make the suggestion that everybody that supported Donald Trump was a racist. However, it would be wrong of me not to confront the president on the language that he uses to talk about behavior. We should judge people based on their behavior, singularly, not their race, not their creed, not their color. So when he comes down the steps in an escalator and says Mexicans are rapists, all of a sudden he just did what you should never do, which is to say, if there's some people who may or may not have been from Mexico that were criminals, that may be true, but it doesn't mean that Mexicans are criminals. When he says that Muslims are terrorists, and there are 1 billion Muslims in the world, you sent the communication to people that if you see anybody like her, that you should be afraid of her because of her faith. Well, that's just wrong. That's inhuman. And that's not something that we should countenance. That is different.
Does that make him popular?
Yeah, well, with some people, it makes him popular. But
how do you address these people?
What you need to do is to have conversations like this and to clearly say that this statement is wrong and this is why. This statement is right. And rather than following that pathway, follow this one. It requires leadership. And at the end of the day, if, again, to the conversation of General Allen yesterday, if people are tired, if they're hungry, if they're afraid, if they're wet, if they're cold, they are going to be susceptible, if they feel like somebody's taking something away from them, to be moved into a nativist mindset. And so our challenge is to not have the world in that condition. That's the most important thing to think about. And that's not something that takes a little bit of time. It takes a lot of time. And so we shouldn't be surprised, because you've seen this over and over again. When people are fighting over a little bit of meat on an otherwise empty bone, our tendency is to turn against each other. So what's the answer? Just to say don't turn against each other? It's no. Make sure that everybody has opportunity. Make sure that there's peace. Make sure that there's social cohesion. Talk about liberal democratic values of equality and liberty, and then win the day. What you cannot do is retreat. You cannot do that. That is not a winning formula for fighting this battle. You have to call it out. You don't have to do it in a hateful way, but you have to do it in a clear and a forceful way, and then create a pathway forward. And then you have to win the day, because in a democracy, if you believe the majority rules, you got to get most of the people to vote for you. That doesn't mean acquiescing. It doesn't mean saying something that's wrong is right. It's calling it out and changing hearts, changing minds, changing institutions, changing laws that produce a better result. And that's what leadership is essentially about.
And it's really dangerous also from a security perspective, by the way, to deny these voices. I mean, you need to listen to that. And again, you need to confront, but first of all, listen. Listen to what keeps people busy. What are they worrying about? Because also I think, I mean, you're a politician. In my position, it's my job to listen to people. To understand why they are not satisfied with policies or with laws. So it's also really dangerous, again, to deny that and indeed have the good conversations and show them what is right, what is wrong, or what can be right, or what can be wrong. And then again, bringing that back to the table and make sure that you and others are making the good policies, the policies that work, because people also want to have good solutions to their problems. It's also because they want to see that we are being effective.
Radical voters, and certainly radical politicians like Geert Wilders or Vlaams Belang or Marine Le Pen, they would say that you position yourself on the right side of history and you are on the right side of the pointing finger, and that from your moral high ground you are dictating what people should say. And they get they do get a grasp in voters follow them and say, yes, it fuels their anger.
Well, I don't know those gentlemen or people that you just talked, but I know who David Duke is in the United States, who was an equivalent, who was the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. he ran for office in Louisiana, and he became a state-level representative, and then he ran for governor, ran for the United States Senate. And for a minute, a lot of people showed up. After confrontation, after explanation, after taking people through, well, you know, maybe he's right about the consequence of a certain policy, but he's wrong about how to fix it. And this is why that's not a good pathway to resolution, but this way is. And you talk to people, you have to trust that the citizens that you represent will eventually get it. But the battle is on the ground where ideas matter, and you have to have the conversation. And at the end of the day, elections really make a difference. And I think what people are beginning to see, so this was manifest yesterday. This is too polite an organization to have had the conversation yesterday when y'all were talking about national security. But what's the consequence of the president's tweets that are diametrically opposed to what the policy of the United States of America is relating to Article 5? Is America going to show up, or is it not going to show up? Well, you heard from everybody yesterday that, of course, America is going to show up. But that's not what the president said. And so he confuses the hell out of people, and he scares our allies. We're spending our time beating up Germany, beating up Canada, beating up Mexico, who are all of our friends, and spending a whole lot of time saddling up to Putin and to bin Salman. Last night, the president stood in between both of them, you know, at the summit that they're at, while the Democrats are talking about how we're going to save America. And so it's no surprise that the world is confused about whether America really means what it says. And you can kind of take comfort in the fact that, well, maybe we don't listen to the president, but a lot of people do, because the presidency matters. He is the president of the United States of America. And whether you disagree with him or not, when he speaks, he is speaking for the country. And it's not honest to say that the tweet doesn't matter, because they are his words. Now, one could argue, and I think argue strenuously, it's not a good idea for a commander-in-chief to be in opposition to the people that are working for him, and that there ought to be cohesion in command and control and policy. That's a legitimate argument, but it's not fair to say that the tweets don't matter, because they are utterances from him, and right now he is the president of the United States, so he speaks for the country. So as a result, people shouldn't be confused that the world is confused about America's position and what we're going to do should something bad happen. And I think that that's something that is worth thinking about. And so it matters when he says things like Muslims are terrorists. That really matters, because the people who are Muslim, and I don't mean to speak for those who are, but if they said all Christians are terrorists, and I'm a Christian, I would go, oh, that didn't feel good. That was just kind of weird. Am I welcome there? Does that guy like me? Am I going to get a fair shot? You know, or is he going to discriminate against me because of my religion? And if I was from Mexico, or I was an immigrant, and I showed up anywhere around the United States, I would go into the shadows, because I would think that ICE agents are coming to get me tomorrow and are going to separate me. So do you think they're going to come out of the shadows, or are they going to stay in the shadows? Yeah. If there's a rape or a sexual abuse in an immigrant neighborhood, do you think they're going to come forward and talk to the police, or they're not? And if you don't have everybody partnering to actually reduce violence and to protect us, then it's going to get worse, not better.
And rhetoric and language and tone is extremely important. We often, I think, underestimate that. But I think, you know, the future of politics also lies in a change of narrative, a change of tone, a change of language. Because it's really needed that if we want to address also these issues, and if we want to recognize people.
How do you do that? Address this radical language. In the Netherlands, you have prime examples of politicians riding the waves with radical.
Exactly. Well, at least don't do the same. But we also need to think of a different narrative. We need to think about a message that is inclusive in itself.
And what is the inclusive message that can also get the white middle-aged men in unemployment?
You can get them.
Well, it starts, I think, also really simple. It starts with saying, well, I'm here for everyone. And I'm here to do politics for everyone who needs it, for the whole society who needs it, for the whole world who needs it. But it's really important to start with the message, I'm here for everyone. And then start the conversation with everyone,
so
everyone you meet.
So you're not the confrontational type of politician. You would not tell an audience to stop racism. You would not go into confrontation.
Of course, you will go into confrontation, and you need to address that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that you can start with spreading the message that, hey, we are here for the whole society. we want to listen, but this is wrong, and this needs to be more right, and this needs to be better. And I do want to have that conversation with you, but I will tell you when you're doing wrong. I will tell you that this is not right. But we need to be open to the conversations with people, because again, if we are going to deny their worries, if we're going to deny their needs, it can be also really wishful and dangerous. But of course, when it's about racism, of course, when it's about injustice, of course, you need to confront that, and you cannot you cannot leave that. Of course not, and that's for me again a very important reason to be in politics, because I want to confront people with that. I want to confront politicians with that. And when I'm speaking about language and tone, it's really also about the politicians that use a kind of rhetoric that is really dangerous for society, and I want them to change that tone, and I want them to change that narrative.
Before we take a few questions, just one from the room. Just one last question on Democratic Party. And do you think it will be a dividing issue of how to address the white voter in America, and who will address it?
Well, first of all, the white community is not monolithic in the United States of America. All white people don't think alike, just like all African American people, or all Muslims, or all Christians. I think the country has proven itself to be open, but sometimes you have to prick the country's consciousness and say, this pathway is wrong. You might be in pain, and you might have been overlooked, but now we see you, but your response to what just happened is not correct. This is the better response for all of us. And by the way, we're all better together. And I think that the community is open to that. You saw during the Civil Rights era, whites and African Americans came together to pass great legislation. But things ebb and flow. It gets okay. We go to sleep. But you have to be eternally vigilant. This notion, yesterday I heard this said as though someone was surprised, that we thought that liberal democracies were going to be stable, that everything was going to be fine. If you go to sleep on it, if you don't nurture democracy every day, it's going to retreat. It's just something that we have to do, and that obligation and that responsibility is never going to end. It's just never going to end. And so I think that you just the word confrontation doesn't translate in our political correctly. I understand what you're trying to say, but to be clear, when confront and confrontation are not the same thing. Address issues forthrightly, so that people can't look away from them, and demand that we work through them to get to a constructive end is the kind of conversation. Yelling at each other doesn't work. But I have seen many, and Jane, you know this, I know you're going to ask a question in a minute. Our job as politicians is to address the issues and to try to change people's minds from where they are to where we need to be. I guess that's what elections are about. And if we can't find a way, then we have to make one. But you can't do it by not recognizing that it's an issue and turning away from it and acting like it doesn't exist. That kind of appeasement is not good. Engagement, constructive engagement is better.
And do some in the party think it would be good to look away?
Oh yeah, most people do. Nobody wants to talk about it.
But I do think that
not nobody, but I mean it's easy to kind of just put aside.
I do think that confrontation can be effective. I mean, you can make sure
True.
that it's being done in an effective way and also respectfully. But I think that given the challenges we face, also in terms of racism and populism, it's really
sometimes
important
you have to fight. I agree with you.
that we do.
No, I agree. I don't disagree with you.
Yeah.
5 minutes of questions from the room, please.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes, you can hear me. I'm Jane Harmon. I served in the U.S. Congress for 9 terms and fled the toxic partisanship to head the Wilson Center, where 40 languages are spoken and we have a majority female workforce. I'm a charter member of the Mitch Landrieu fan club and think it's great to have idealistic young women in politics in Europe. My question is this: is there a danger that we overcorrect for our history? By taking down all the statues, I'm not commending any of the statues, do we erase a memory of the bad parts of our history? And specifically, I read recently that the Chinese, on the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square, have basically erased that from Chinese history. They've rewritten all the textbooks, and a majority of their population is under 30, it's 30 years old, and don't even know that that happened. Don't we also learn from history, even if it's bad history?
Would you like me to?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Mitch.
of course.
Well, you conflated two things that are opposite. It would be terrible for the world to forget what happened in Tiananmen Square, because that was about democracy and telling the true story and the total story of what actually happened. Taking down the monuments is the exact opposite of that, because the monuments, I'm talking about the Confederate monuments now, were put up in places of reverence, not remembrance, on public spaces, to only talk about 4 years of history and ignore the rest of it. So not only those things, in fact, are the suppression of the total story of history. Of course you can overcorrect. We do this all the time. In every problem that we try to solve, we tend to go too far, then we come back in balance. But that is not to say that our public spaces, spaces of reverence, should be reserved for those things that are integral to the stories that we want to tell. And by the way, to address the issue directly, maybe one of the harshest things that I said in the book that I wrote was that if all of the historical society's mission was to protect our history, and they did it just by putting up Confederate monuments, then they are guilty of historic malfeasance, because they forgot the other 296 years of our history. And by the way, ladies, there are not that many statues of women anywhere in the world. And so I would think that, putting the issue of race aside for a second and the issue of gender, the women of the world might have a problem with only remembering the guys that kind of showed up and didn't do as much as they said. Right? Now think about it from a gender perspective and take it out of race, and it all of a sudden becomes a little bit more immediate as it relates to gender. So when you think about it, ask yourself, just in terms of monuments, have we adequately and historically commemorated the contributions that women have made to the world, if the way we have chosen to do it is to put up a monument to reflect a person who did a good thing? The obvious answer would be no, we didn't even get it close to being right. The bigger issue about these monuments, I don't want to get lost on the stone and the metal. It's not the physical things themselves. It's the ideas and the people who put them up. And if those ideas still permeate our policies and still generate the kind of consequences that we have, then we have not moved as forward together. So not only is it not history, it's not even past. And I would ask us to challenge us to just really think about that. And when you take a minute to think about it, like Wynton asked me to think about it, and you're honest and you're open, you would say, we're falling short and we can do better. And yes, we need balance, but we're out of balance at the moment.
I agree.
One question. We have two more questions. Two of you.
Hello. Good morning. Thank you so much for your amazing comments. My name is Cece Battle, and I run a national nonprofit in the U.S. that trains young leaders to lead in all industries, but rooted in social justice values and solutions. And we've been around for 15 years. We have 2,000 young and young-ish people in all 50 states and territories. And one of the conflicts or things that they grapple with, all of us, is race, to be the big boogeyman. And I'm really glad that this conversation centered race. But my question to you is, what is the path forward, since you all talked about healthy confrontation, and specifically in your experience that someone checked you and helped you see the mission? One of the earlier sessions that we had, because I'm a TILN fellow, was that when you talk about racism and white supremacy, you scare white people. And in our experience, some of the conflicts that we've had is that it seems that people are more, they want to hold on to their comfort rather than progress. So I'm curious to know how. What is the path forward? How do we have healthy confrontation in a way that actually leads to success? Would really love to know your answer. Thank you.
Please, Samira.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you. Well, I can speak from my own experience, and what I've done myself and what I will keep doing is to bring in that experience, is to bring in that understanding, is to indeed discuss this and name it like it is, but bringing in my own, again, knowledge, and use that to explain to people why it is so important that we talk about it. Why it is so important that we talk about it in this way. Why it is so important for young people of color, for example, or women of color. Because these are the associations that I have myself. And I will not deny my own experiences, I will not do that. I think it only makes you a credible voice. And yes, people can even attack you for that or target you for that. But it's really needed that politicians dare to bring in their identity. So I can only speak from my own experience that this is my way to put that on the agenda and to name it as it is and not scare away. But to have that healthy confrontation, you can use your own experience to make people also more maybe comfortable by explaining it and taking that time. But it needs to be said how it is. Yeah, and I'm doing that by bringing in my own identity and experiences.
Mitch, a quick word, yeah.
Yeah, a couple,
how not
couple
to frighten.
things. From the macro to the micro. First of all, people who feel this way should run for office, because who's in office matters, because they help dictate suggestions about what laws to change. When Jane was a congressperson from California, she would basically say, you know, next week I want to introduce a bill to accomplish a certain thing, and that would create a national conversation that in many instances would lead to changing the laws. So that's really important, A. Secondly, it's not a surprise that now that the elected politicians who are elected are diverse, we're actually discussing different kinds of issues, because when different kind of people get elected, they bring their life experiences like you've alluded to. On specific issues that currently exist, for people that don't think this is real, gerrymandering of congressional districts has a massive racial component. Voter suppression has a lot to do with whether Stacey Abrams, who's a person of color, should be the governor of Georgia today. She clearly should be, but she's not. So when people say these things don't currently exist, looking at all of the wonderful people here that talk about national security, after the war ended, the Korean War, and the GI Bill was passed, you know, our folks came back from the war. African Americans who fought and died, or who fought and were harmed, came back and had to go live in neighborhoods and were discriminated against because they couldn't get loans to actually buy the houses and build generational wealth. So those are specific things you have to do. All the while, and I think you hit this well, you do have to send the message that when we mean everybody, we mean everybody. Not just people of color, but white people too. Everybody is invited to this table. So it's not about taking something away. No. I asked my dad, who was, when he was 29 years old, was one of two white guys in the legislature to vote against segregation packages. In other words, he took the modern view that history has said was the right one, and his life was threatened that day in 1960 when my mother was carrying me. And I said, how did you get where you are? And he said, my best friend, first African American to graduate from law school, Norman Francis, who went on to become the president of Xavier University, longest serving president of a university in America, and a Presidential Medal of Freedom on it. Was my father's best friend. He was in law school. And I said, Dad, how did you find the courage to protect Norman? That was his name. He said, Mitch, I didn't do it for Norman. He said, I did it for myself. He said, because of Norman made me better. Norman's presence in my life, his intellect, his talent made me better. And so it wasn't just about him. And so this is what I say to all the white people who seem to be so overly concerned about all this. You don't need to be worried about it. African Americans will treat us a whole lot better than we treated them. That's first. And the second thing is, you're better when you meet people who are different than you. The diversity and the gifts that each of us has that is unique and special, that makes us who we are, whether you're Christian, Muslim, Jew, you're black, you're white, you're American, you're from the Netherlands, you bring a different experience that only you can bring. And when you're open to each other and you learn from each other, our collection is better than our individual parts. That's just a truth. Now, if you don't believe in that truth, if you somehow believe that because you were born white and blonde-haired and blue-eyed, that you're smarter, faster, and better, not only are you wrong, you could be right individually, but it's not because of the way you look. It could be just because of your talent. But if you believe that, then you can only believe that separating everybody and lording over everybody is the right way to go. I just don't happen to believe that truth. And so I'm like you. I have to live in my truth. I have to live in my experience. I have to tell people who I saw and what I did and how I felt and how I'm better when I build relationships with people that I've never met before. And that's my truth. And so in order to change it, you have to live it. You have to testify to it. And you have to be really, I believe, unfortunately, more forceful about it than we should have to be in this moment in time. And I'll just go back to this. and I just have seen this in my very short life. You got to fight for it every day. If you don't nurture it, if you don't water it, if you don't till it, it's going to die. And that's kind of what freedom is about, isn't it? I mean, essentially, that's what we're talking about when you get back to it. And that's why it's so compelling and so important for us to confront or to deal with in a constructive and thoughtful way. And if we have to fight for it, you know what? So be it.
I'm afraid we have to conclude here. Many questions in the room, but it's energizing ideas for the day. Thank you. Thank you also for the audience. Thank you so much.